Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. I know most of you, but if you're new to the center, my name is Charles Thang. I'm the director here, and welcome to our Monday morning lecture and lunch. It is a great privilege to welcome Nicole Bauer to deliver today's lecture entitled Mystics Made the Revolution. Curious to know what the second slide will reveal. But Nicole is joining us as a visiting scholar this semester from the University of Tulsa. I'm sure Nicole will narrate this, but I believe Nicole's work has made more than one turn in recent years. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about this most recent turn. So please join me in welcoming Nicole Bauer. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Nicole Bauer. Thank you for that introduction. So I'm here to talk to you about a few things. Near-death experiences. Let's see if I can show the slide. How do I click? Trying to get the slide up. So what should I do for now? Yeah. So click that instead of the arrow? Yeah. Okay. Ecstatic experiences. No, that's no. No. There like that? Okay. Yes. So yes, thank you for coming today, and I really appreciate it. So I'll just try to make it short. I am going to start by talking about near-death experiences, and basically what I have to say is that near-death experiences are real, the afterlife is real, consciousness can exist outside the body, and that's all I have to say. Where's the mic so I can drop it? Yeah, thank you. Oh, did you want me to say more?
Yes, elaborate.
All right, well, for the folks on Zoom, the people here twisted my arm, and they're quite ferocious. So I will try to say a little bit more. And I also do want to apologize because I was dragged into a dance contest over at the Div school. And when it was my turn to dance in front of a group of Div students, and there was no alcohol at the event, so it made it worse. They announced me as Nicole of the CSWR, and I said, no, please do not hold them responsible for my dancing. That's not, and I also did not win. So, but I was also instructed at the CSWR that when you give a talk, you should just not flutter around a topic. You should have a stance. You should take an argument. So that's what I decided to do. I'm not actually here to make bold ontological claims. Not that I'm opposed to that. But I would like to make an argument about these experiences in the 18th century. So I'm going to try to change the slide here. Okay, so this is the main argument that I would like to try to get across to you here, is that experiences of altered states of consciousness are integral to the period known as the Enlightenment. And it's not these experiences that we would call altered states or mystical experiences are not merely on the fringes. And I even want to claim that we would not have had the new philosophies and movements of the Enlightenment, especially the radical movements, without the experiences of near-death, ecstatic vision, possession, and even dreams. And this ties to themes of embodiment and intersubjectivity. So let me just explain a little bit here and unpack it and see if I can make this case for you this morning. One thing I want to say is that, of course, we know that there's a connection between religion and culture and religion and politics. That's been well established. And we also know that sometimes people who have mystical experiences or mystics get involved in radical politics, but not always. So I'm not saying that every mystic or person who has had a mystical experience becomes socially engaged. Sometimes it's quite the opposite. They go and live in the Himalayas and live in a cave or something and don't become involved. or they don't become politically engaged in a way that would align with our sensibilities, in a way that we would find sympathetic. But I do see, as a historian, that there are these experiences throughout the 18th century where people do become politically engaged in very interesting ways and espouse a radical politics that is more aligned with the revolutions at the end of the 18th century, and certainly more radical than the more moderate thinkers we associate with the Enlightenment, called the philosophes, like people like Hume or Kant or Voltaire, figures like Diderot, figures like that. So, and I also want to parse some terms here or define what I'm saying here. I am going to use the phrase spiritually transformative experience. And this is valuable to me for certain reasons. Sometimes I know that there are many conflicting and contested definitions of mysticism and a mystical experience. Many people see a mystical experience as, of course, containing something of the ineffable, and an encounter with the numinous, which I do agree with, and some kind of ego dissolution. With a lot of these experiences, you do have that, but not always. And so we could also say altered states, right? Altered states might be a little safer in the sense that it's slightly more secular, maybe, and can entail all kinds of experiences. So I would like to use the term spiritually transformative experience, because a lot of these experiences do include the ineffable, but not all of them. Some of them are very articulate, and like as in the case of Swedenborg, but they are having encounters with the numinous, as I said, and what is interesting to me especially is this lasting transformation that occurs as a result of these experiences. We also see these experiences as something happening in the body, and people are describing the body. In the case of near-death experiences, it involves some form of physical trauma. And this other term, intersubjectivity, is really important to me too, because what often happens when people have these experiences and then come out of them is they have a deeper sense of connection, or even a sense of the self as wider and more fluid and encompassing other individuals or nature. And instead of this sort of Kantian black hole of subjectivity where we're trapped in that, we can't really know or see what others are experiencing, what we see with these figures who've had these experiences is intersubjectivity, in the sense of having a sense of connection or even shared knowing with a group. And this connects to modern ideas of affect theory, which I hope to get into. So the other thing about mystics as radicals, yes, they are not always politically engaged, but they are, in a sense, always radical and dangerous, because they're threatening in the sense that they have direct or claim direct contact with the divine or direct transmission. And they often become misfits, or they often don't fit, or their position becomes dangerous. You know, the joke that mystics often, they're either going to be 50-50 a saint or 50-50 burned at the stake. So it's really not, it's always a dangerous, precarious, and radical position to be a mystic and claim direct contact with the divine. So that's kind of my parsing of those terms and why I'm going to use spiritually transformative experience. So the next slide, here's me being a historian, and I just want to give you this background, because I don't assume that everybody has this background on the Enlightenment and what is the Enlightenment. A lot of people think it's this picture, these very well-educated, polished people who are having a very rational and cordial conversation. And that is certainly part of it. That was the Enlightenment, right? And so I think that among, let's say, lay people, there's the classic narrative of the Enlightenment that we became more rational, we became more secular, we started to discuss things like human rights and abolishing torture. And that's kind of the understanding among everyday people, or Steven Pinker. But yeah, sorry for that take. But among scholars, it's totally the opposite in many ways. At least in the 80s and 90s, they totally trashed the Enlightenment in the academy. it was just unsalvageable, irredeemable. There was this idea that, especially with the rise of post-colonial theory and all these studies, that the Enlightenment was a time when Europe was enriching itself through the slave trade and through colonialism. And this is why they were able to create an environment where they could have these discussions and they had this prosperity. And so they were starting to develop a discourse of human rights, but at the same time excluding people from those human rights. And really, among historians, there was just nothing you could say that was good about the Enlightenment. So it was trashed. Recently, in recent decades, there have been revisionist approaches to the Enlightenment that maybe there are some things we could salvage about it. Maybe there are new approaches we could take to it. Let's see if I can. New approaches. So especially in other fields like queer theory or disability theory. So these new approaches are looking at the Enlightenment from that perspective and seeing, looking at gender, for example, how much women and people across the gender spectrum were involved in the Enlightenment. So there's been kind of these new rapprochement in the academy with the Enlightenment, but it's still very much contested. And it's sort of like the critiques I just mentioned to you, they are adjacent, but not the same thing as what you might hear today, that the Enlightenment is the source of the rise of secularism and then our growing alienation and exploitation with nature, alienation from ourselves and from nature, and then this crisis of meaning that we have in the modern age. Does this make sense? It's kind of like, yes. So that is another critique that is adjacent to the critique that was coming out in the 80s and 90s. So there have been recent revisions of scholarship, and there also have been new approaches to the Enlightenment that talk about how religion, of course, influenced the Enlightenment. It wasn't just this complete secularization and rationalization and de-Christianization, although there were those threads. There's all kinds of different threads. There is a Catholic Enlightenment. There is Tikkun Olam in the Jewish Enlightenment. And then there's regional enlightenments now. There's the French, of course, but there's the Scottish Enlightenment, like Smith and Hume and that sort of thing. So that's how it's sort of evolved over time. So this is kind of me giving you a quick lit review. The other thing is that the philosophes, the thinkers of the Enlightenment who we traditionally associate with it, have a complicated relationship with revolution. It's really the French Revolution that invented the Enlightenment and this narrative that the Enlightenment led to revolution. If you look at the philosophes, they are much more moderate and wary of any kind of radical politics and radical movements. And the revolutionaries are of a younger generation who were frustrated with the philosophe and felt like they couldn't access the social prestige and notoriety that they enjoyed, and then get involved in revolution. So that's more recent scholarship as well. And so if we look at the revolutions, the American, the French, and the Haitian Revolution specifically, this age of revolutions at the end of the 18th century, the radical politics that we see in some of those revolutions are really wild and unconscionable to the philosophe of the 18th century. So the things that were really radical then would not be that radical to us now, maybe, like anti-slavery or gender equality or racial equality, or things like legalizing divorce, which the Jacobins did in the French Revolution, or equal inheritance for illegitimate and legitimate children, decriminalizing homosexuality, which the Jacobins did in the French Revolution. So these kinds of things were considered out of this world crazy radical, which today we might not see as radical. They even experimented with things like the welfare state and universal health care and universal education. Again, considered very radical positions. So that's something I want to mention. One thing, though, in general, that we can see in the traditional narrative of the Enlightenment, these new revisionist approaches, and even in the revolutions, is the Enlightenment, among other things, is characterized by a new encouragement to question authority and tradition. And the revolutions are really very much about a desire to reconfigure reality. And maybe you can see I'm hinting at something here. When people have these spiritually transformative experiences, they also often have this impulse to reconfigure reality. And they see reality as something that can be malleable and reconfigured. So this is true for the Enlightenment in general, and it is true for the revolutions. So that's like my overview of the scholarship. Okay, first, I'm going to focus on, just in the interest of time, and these are things that I have been investigating here while I've been a research fellow, and I've had the great pleasure and honor to talk to great people and access amazing documents at the Div School, at the Houghton. So it's really been invaluable for my project. And there's so many things I could talk to you about that I want to talk to you about, but I'm going to focus on near-death experiences, ecstatic visions, possession, and dreams. And even those are all huge topics. So just in case you weren't sure, this is a working definition of the near-death experience, an experience of an altered state of consciousness during physical trauma. So there's that embodiment, includes an out-of-body experience, seeing a bright light, feelings of peace and bliss, otherworldly visions resulting in lasting positive change. This quotation I have here at the top is from Michel de Montaigne's near-death experience. And yes, I'm going to say that he had a near-death experience. And this is from his own first-person account of his experience. The painting here is a contemporary painting of an NDEer. That's what we call people who have had NDEs, what he saw during his NDE. And about, I think for him, that was 2006. So we do often have, this is pretty consistent and consistent across, I know it's a little controversial, but consistent across time, cultures, and the research actually does support this. There is often a sense of ineffability, as in other mystical experiences, a bright light, strong feelings of peace or well-being despite trauma to the body, conviction of the reality of the experience, and more importantly and most interestingly for me is the aftermath, the transformation of the self. They often have enhanced empathy, which is kind of a sub-part of intersubjectivity, new insights or creativity, sometimes incredible creative abilities and insight, and of course the paranormal, which is this unruly thing that often follows people who have had an experience like this, not just NDEs. The paranormal is like this weird critter that keeps popping up and behaving in strange ways and in ways that we cannot pin down, the ways that we cannot define and or easily explain away. So I'm starting with Michel de Montaigne, even though he did not live in the 18th century. He lived in the 16th century, but he is relevant here and I think really key because he is known as the father of the Enlightenment and even the father of skepticism. But it's skepticism in the way that we should truly define it, the real definition of skepticism, as in being open-minded and skeptical about all dominant narratives. He's not skeptical in the sort of contemporary reductive way people use it now. And he lived at a time of intense upheaval of the religious wars in France between Protestants and Catholics, also of the time of the discovery of the New World, which was very unsettling to Europeans. He was a humanist, and a humanist at the time of the Renaissance was someone who deified the ancients. Antiquity was the best, and the best all one could be. And he knew Latin before he knew French. He had read all of the classics, and like a good humanist. And he was very troubled that Plato did not know about the New World, which he writes about in his essays. And in 1570 or 1571, we're not quite sure, he had a near-death experience where he fell from his horse, and according to witnesses, he was vomiting blood and clawing at his throat and trying to tear his doublet. But his experience, his phenomenological experience, was that he was floating in a cloud of bliss and the pain was completely gone. And he could not imagine how peaceful it had been. His approach to death up until this point had been, again, through his training as a humanist, as a Stoic, that you should face death and hardship with courage and with gritted teeth and try to not be afraid of it. But after the experience, his reaction to death was completely different. He lost his fear of death, but it wasn't this sort of stoic, aristocratic bravery. It was more this like, oh, it's totally fine. There's nothing to fear. And what's golden about these accounts I have found is that it's a first-person account. This differs from some medieval accounts that are often written by someone interpreting and filtering what someone else said. all of these accounts that I've found, Montaigne and the others from the 18th century, are first-person accounts, which are just gems for a historian. And I will say that he was not someone, he's not a mystic. He's not particularly religious. He was nominally Catholic, but he was known for his skepticism about how fanatical people were getting, where you had Protestants killing Catholics and vice versa. But he's such a brilliant and incredible and creative and outside the box thinker for the 16th century. And he was read and reread, and any educated person from the 17th and 18th century read Montaigne. Everybody read him. And he was known for his unusual empathy, which, according to Montaigne scholars, only grew as he matured. And he had a almost weird empathy for people you would not expect. For a member of the elite of the French aristocracy, he would have empathy for people of different social classes, even animals, where he talks about he doesn't like hunting because he doesn't like watching the dogs tear apart a deer. So that was really hard for him to watch, which is very unusual for a French nobleman. I can't stress that enough. He wrote about how he didn't think torture and very violent executions were helpful or a good idea. And he said, why don't you just, instead, if you want to have an example, why don't you mutilate the body after the person's dead so they don't feel pain? And he wrote this in his book, and then he published it and wanted to show it to everybody. And he brought it with him when he traveled. He traveled around. He was a man of leisure. He brought it to Rome. And when he was in Rome, church officials confiscated his book and just kind of, redacted it and wrote things like error, you can't say this, and you can't say that, it's wrong to torture people, and this is very exemplary to punishment that we need to have. And they did return it to him. He didn't get arrested or anything or investigated by the Inquisition, but he got in trouble. And they told him, you need to fix this in your book, but he did not. He kept it as it is. So a lot of people who are skeptical about NDEs today will say, oh, it's something like the cultural source hypothesis, that this is really, people are seeing what they expect to see. And it's informed by their upbringing, their family, their culture, and their religion. And the evidence does not always back that up. We see people like Montaigne, who never in the world, he's not particularly religious, he doesn't expect to have a near-death experience, but it transforms him. And even scholars of Montaigne for generations who would not admit this is an NDE, they admit there's something about this event where he fell from his horse that changed him and prompted him to write his essay, which are his famous works, the works that he is famous for now. And they can't explain it. They don't know why it's significant, but it is significant, and it did alter him permanently. So there are other theorists, like if you look at Culiano, he will talk about direct transmission, that, okay, maybe Montaigne and these others, they're not reading about other people having near-death experiences, but it's not a direct transmission, but maybe it's in the culture and they pick it up unconsciously, and then that informs their experience. And it's possible, of course, culture informs these experiences, but again, there's so much surprising and unexpected elements. There's changes that alter these people, that they're not in a million years what they expect. And so I'm leaning again on, like many others, on a classic author, on William James's approach to mystical experiences. I just can't help it. I walked by his house just a block away. The idea that, okay, maybe you don't know exactly what's happening in a mystical experience, but let's look at the fruits of the experience. The fruits are incredible with these figures, and again, totally unexpected. And so I'd like to say that as well. And so moving to the 18th century, I found just a few figures who are just fantastic. I was more than overjoyed when I found these manuscripts in the Houghton of people, again, first-person accounts talking about their experiences. So I have one figure, Georges de Benneville, a French aristocrat and Huguenot who had to flee France after the Protestants were, the Edict of Nantes was revoked and the Protestants were kicked out of France. He grew up in England. He was raised, the Huguenots in France are basically Calvinist. Okay, so if you know about Calvinism, basically this idea that there is an elect who are predestined for heaven and everyone else is going to hell. That's a basic description of predestination. And that's how he was raised. And when he was young, he had an illness and he had a near-death experience, and he wrote it down. And you have these gorgeous, fantastic descriptions of him going to heaven and meeting angels. But you also have a lot of these descriptions of things he says are beyond words. It's so beautiful, I can't describe it. It's so incredible. And then he had this vision of souls being led by angels out of hell and coming up into heaven, and then everything's singing and everything's gorgeous, and it's a long, elaborate narrative. And he came out of it with the conviction that everyone is saved. Everyone's going to heaven and predestination is wrong. And he later became a founder of the Universalist Church and came over to Pennsylvania. So he's telling all and sundry about this. He's thrilled about this. He can't stop telling everybody. And so the church elders called him into a meeting and they told him, what's going on with you? And he told them, oh, actually, I think everyone's going to heaven. I believe in universalism, and universalism is a theme here in these figures. And so they kicked him out. They kicked him out of the church, and he said, fine, I don't care. And he just preached all over Europe. He went to France, immediately got arrested, and had many paranormal events of himself and people around him. This is his claims. And then went over to Pennsylvania and lived a long time, lived until the 1780s. And during the American Revolution, treated wounded on both sides, became very much involved with indigenous communities, and tried to learn medicine techniques from them. And I'm sure there probably was some parochialism involved in that, but definitely a sense that everyone has this divine spark and everyone is saved, and there's no fear of eternal damnation, which is really not a Calvinist stance. And he was not expecting this. Nothing in his upbringing would turn him towards this, except maybe you could say, maybe he was suffering from some salvation anxiety, and that may have led him to have this conviction. But it made him feel like he should risk his life many times and travel all over preaching this doctrine that he had discovered in his NDE. Another beautiful figure is Thomas Say, a Quaker. And this is an American Quaker in the 18th century, and he had a near-death experience when he was very young. And of course, we know the Quakers have an egalitarian stance and believe in racial equality, but when he had this experience, he became even more adamant. And this is something I see a lot in these figures, is they become adamant on things like racial, sometimes even gender equality, and they harp on it. They harp on it in their statements, in their reports. They say that I believe everyone is saved and God loves everyone equally, and therefore this racial discrimination is totally false. And we even have this one that Thomas Say, he says that at the end of his statement, he wrote his statement, in regards to the world, I believe that walking contrary to its maxims, customs, and politics as Christ did is the best thing I can do, right? So it's this sense of kind of being misfits, being unruly, being unexpected, happy to buck the norm, happy to defy authority even and establish their own authority. That's sort of a theme here as well. There's also a strong theme in these figures of egalitarianism and universalism, and they really harp on it. They're radical about this, much more so than sort of the tepid pronouncements about maybe we should be anti-slavery that we see in, again, the philosophe like Hume. Hume was sort of anti-slavery, but was never sort of as emphatic as these figures. And then finally, the figure I want to introduce you to is, you've probably heard of this person, Public Universal Friend. That's the picture on the bottom. And Public Universal Friend, if you know of this person, was even among Quakers, a misfit in Rhode Island, grew up in a family where her two brothers were kicked out of the Quakers for joining the American Revolution. Her sister was kicked out for getting pregnant out of wedlock. And then she was kicked out for kind of basically shopping around religiously and checking out all the different sects. And this is a time between the first and second Great Awakenings in the American colonies. So it's a heady time of religious experimentation as well as political instability. And this person was born Jemima Wilkinson and had a fever, probably typhus, in the year 1776, so significant year, fell ill, had a near-death experience, reports many of the standard aspects, and talks to two angels who claim that there's room in heaven for everybody, and came out of the experience claiming that Jemima Wilkinson had died and the body was now inhabited by this living spirit of God, the living spirit. And from then on claimed that this body was a genderless spirit, the spirit of God, and went around preaching as a genderless being and changed their name to Public Universal Friend. I like to call them Puff, but I don't know if that's going to stick. So Puff was just going around claiming that they were a genderless spirit. And again, like it's tricky to use pronouns here because to say non-binary is anachronistic, right? They don't have those terms because they actually didn't think of gender binaries in the same ways they do later in the 19th century. So Puff has gotten a lot of attention in the past 10 years with people in queer studies because of this gendered aspect. I think Puff is also very exciting because of this near-death experience that they report, and it's also something that we could call, which is controversial even in the NDE community, a walk-in. If you're familiar with this, the walk-in is where supposedly someone has a near-death experience, their spirit or soul takes off and gives permission to another spirit or soul to come into the body and then take over, and that's the spirit animating that body for the rest of their life. That's called a walk-in. So we could actually classify this as a walk-in. We could also classify this as actually a kind of possession, a voluntary possession, and as we'll see, possessions sometimes are very voluntary, but possession by God. So Public Universal Friend went around, preached very virulently against slavery, has a famous sermon on the rights of indigenous peoples. And she or they are very disruptive in the sense of the gender aspect, of course, but also rupturing hierarchies, defying ideas of property. They talked about sharing land. They talked about sharing things with indigenous peoples. So disruptive, unruly, misfit types in a lot of ways. And again, yes, she does have this Quaker upbringing, but not exactly something we would automatically expect. It's not like there were lots of other women who were claiming to be genderless spirit bodies who were being possessed. So Puff is just a fantastic figure for that reason. So I would love to talk about this even more, but in the interest of time, I'll keep going. The other mystical experience or spiritually transformative experience I'd like to talk about is the ecstatic vision. And I want to show you a clip and we'll see if it works. Okay. It's from the film The Testament of Anne Lee. You've seen it. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Lori. Thank you. So this is one thing I want to be a takeaway here. There are so many ways to think of the Enlightenment. And as much as it is rational people sitting around and having a very cordial conversation in these public spaces that are kind of made famous by Habermas, the famous intellectual just passed away, public spaces where people would have rational consensus-reaching discussion. This is also theorized by Hannah Arendt in coffee houses and marketplaces and squares and intellectual salons. Yes, that is the Enlightenment. You had rising literacy rates and more people moving to cities, all of that. But it's also stuff like this. And it's not just figures of the popular classes or just women or just indigenous or people of color, even though that was how these sort of ecstatic, convulsive, religious, embodied, intense experiences were portrayed. You have even members of the elite sometimes getting engaged in this. And the two movements, there's there's many instances of this throughout the 18th century. The two movements that I want to highlight here are the Convulsionnaires of Saint-Médard, who are these Jansenists, mostly women, having these intense convulsive, you could say almost what we might today call like Kundalini type. So if someone encountered that today in today's American New Age culture, that's what they would call it. And the Shakers, who are a Quaker sect that developed in England in the 1750s and eventually moved over to New York in the 1770s. So both of them very much center women's experiences and elevate and honor a woman's contact with the divine and ability to have transmission and even relate and be a source of divine revelation. And you also have, it's not just a Protestant phenomenon. The Convulsionnaires, the Jansenists they're kind of hard to define, but they're basically a sect within French Catholicism. That's I'll just say that. They have a very strong Augustinian bent. They were very classy in the 17th century. In 17th century France, they had figures like Pascal and Racine, who were well-educated, members of the elite. In the 18th century, the sect grew and encompassed more members and became decidedly more feminine and more working class. And I kind of call them the ragamuffin Jansenists, because they're a lot less respectable. And they had a figure who they saw as a saint. He was not canonized as a saint, but to them, he was a holy man. He passed away and he was buried in a cemetery in Paris called Saint-Médard. And people started hanging out around his grave because they saw him as a holy man, claimed miracles were happening around the grave, and started convulsing violently, uncontrollably around the grave. And the numbers grew, and they were mostly women, but not only women, having these convulsive experiences around his grave. And these images you see here are people trying to see if these women's bodies are feeling pain while they're in these convulsive experiences, and they claimed they were not. This drew a lot of suspicion, especially from authorities who were very troubled by this. They tried to close the cemetery, they locked the gates, and people just started gathering outside the gates and convulsing at the gates. And then when even that was curtailed, they started gathering in public homes and having these experiences, and also claiming divine revelation, also claiming all kinds of miracles, especially miraculous healings. That's very common. And just like for the near-death experiences, I forgot to mention that they also claimed miraculous healing. Thomas Say, the Quaker I mentioned, claimed that he could heal by laying of the hands on people after his experience. And also this connects to people would have dreams about him, where if they were ill, they would have a dream telling them where to go, and they would go to him, and he would, as if he would expect them, he would lay hands over them, and they would be cured of things like tumors and consumption and things like this. So this is a very troublesome movement to authorities. This is about that. This happens in the 1730s, but continues into the next decades in France. And especially for the French, and France is kind of my home base. This is, I was trained in French history. It's very troublesome because they had an epidemic of demonic possession in the 17th century that was very troublesome and hard to tame. And they didn't know how to define it, starting in the 1640s and moving through the 17th century. And this is, of course, overlapping with the scientific revolution, and some people were really terrified about the devil, and others were saying it was just madness and hysteria. A lot of them were women being possessed by the devil. And of course, now scholars see a connection between the scientific revolution and witch hunts and this mania, this fear and paranoia about the devil. There's actually a tie, it's actually tied together. More on that later if you like in the Q&A. But the French had that legacy in the 17th century. And if you're curious, Aldous Huxley wrote a fantastic book about this called The Devils of Loudun. Check it out. Then in the early 17th century, early 18th century, end of the 17th century, when Louis XIV expelled Protestants from France, there were some hiding out in the Cevennes Mountains. This is around 1700. And they're called the Camisards. And the Camisards also had these kinds of experiences of convulsions, all kinds of prophecies, trance, spirits involved, and miraculous healings, all kinds of things. And then as a result of these experiences, they became politically engaged, felt motivated, thought God was supporting them to mount a violent revolt. And it was brutally put down in around, like I said, early 18th century. So with this history of the demonic epidemic in the 17th century, we could say, and the Camisard rebellion in the early 18th century, French authorities are very suspicious of this kind of thing, especially because it's mostly working class women having these convulsions and claiming it's God, right? Similarly, the Shakers are even kind of a weirdo sect of the Quakers, and they were initially grouped around this married couple that claimed that the second coming was imminent and that Christ would come in the form of a woman's body, and believed and preached radical gender equality, which is really, really quite unusual for the mid-18th century, even as we are in the midst of the Enlightenment. And again, experienced these convulsive movements, and people would talk about them dancing and shouting and screaming, like in the clip you saw. And it was just a fantastic coincidence that this film, The Testament of Anne Lee, came out while I was working on this project. So that was really exciting for me. And I really do see overlap, even though Catholic, Protestant, French, English, we have differences here, but there's a lot of overlap here. So just moving on, to contextualize this a little bit further, there was a whole debate actually around enthusiasm in the 18th century, where it was a problem for some, but there were also, it had its defenders. And Locke, who you see on top, John Locke, believed that enthusiasm was a major problem. And for the English, they have the legacy of the English Civil War, sometimes called the English Revolution, where, of course, the Puritans under Cromwell go nuts and execute the king, take over. You also had this flurry of radical politics influenced by religion, people like the Levelers and the Diggers who believed that you should abolish property or you should abolish the class system. Going further back in the memory of Europeans is the German Peasants' War, if anyone's familiar with this. This is in the 16th century. After Luther, there was a German mystic named Münzer, and he had a epic falling out with Luther. Luther called him the devil, and Münzer called him the paper pope, and was really mystical and led a bunch of German peasants in a radically egalitarian move for abolishing serfdom and having freedom. They're claiming that if Luther says everyone is equal before God and priesthood of all believers, right, the famous Luther statement, why does not that then extend to and apply to social and political equality, right? It's like, you can see how they're making that connection in their minds, but in the minds of Luther and others, that is not what he meant. And the German peasants had their hurrah, but they were brutally put down and Münzer was executed. So there is this legacy of, for Locke, people going overboard, going crazy because of religion and applying it to radical politics. And that's really problematic because look what happened in England. They executed the king and it was crazy. So he's following Hobbes in the sense that this is really something we have to protect ourselves against. And according to William Paul Simmons, he really calls Locke's philosophy a philosophy of dread, that there's a dread of joy, there's a dread of enthusiasm. There is this epistemological dread that if you are claiming knowledge through some kind of revelation or through you are swept away and caught up in the moment, how can you claim that that knowledge is reliable, right? So it's both a social dread and an epistemological dread that Locke is very worried about. There is, of course, he's famous for his treatise on religious tolerance, but he excluded Catholics. He said they didn't really count. He's also famous for his protection of property. So he's worried about the precariousness of property. He's worried about social chaos and even philosophical chaos that could come from enthusiasm. Hume, who's half a century later, is a little more conciliatory towards enthusiasm, right? Hume, of course, the great Scottish philosopher. And he also thought that with enthusiasm, it is dangerous because someone could be led to defy the current order. Those are Hume's words. But he did think that enthusiasm was better than superstition, right? Superstition, often the word of the philosophe, the bugaboo, the bête noire is we don't want superstition. That's the Dark Ages. And so for Hume, he associated superstition with anxiety and fear. And he said, well, at least with enthusiasm, it has a spirit of liberty to it. So it's not as bad as superstition, but it's still not, he's still very wary of it. So that's Hume's stance. Between them, the generation between them is the Earl of Shaftesbury, another well-known English thinker. And Locke was actually his tutor. So that's Shaftesbury on the bottom there with his wig, and then that's Shaftesbury being casual on the right with his brother in his garden. For him, he actually defended enthusiasm and saw it as really essential and valuable to a society. And it's like I said, it's interesting because Locke was his tutor, and he thought that with enthusiasm, you have a simultaneous rising of the self and a connection with the whole. And Shaftesbury, a little bit also Hume, is much more aligned with our contemporary understanding of affect theory than someone like Locke and others who were, most of them in the 18th century, were pretty mechanistic about how we experience emotions or affect, right? And Hume, to some extent, Adam Smith, but especially Shaftesbury, are very clear that affect is something that can be shared, is sort of like a contagion, but not in a bad way between groups of people. And this is sort of what you could see if you're at a concert or a rave, or even having a great party. There's a sense of emotion that is shared, or even sometimes, if you're really in the moment, a fluid sense of self where the boundaries of the self are kind of merging with others in the group. And that's what you see in the convulsions and the shakers. You have that sense. You also get that sense in the Haitian Revolution. And there is that idea that in these possession rituals of the Haitian Revolution, they would have this sense of connection to others or connection to the spirits. And in Haitian Vodou, which is, as many scholars have established, very much related to an influential of the Haitian Revolution, they have a pantheon of deities, or several pantheons. And there's the main god, the bon Dieu, there is the deities, and then there are the lois, which are spirits. And these spirits are often the ones that come and mount a practitioner and in these possession rituals. And there is sort of this merging and loss of the self, as well as a merging with other people around you. And but it is totally voluntary. You're asking the law to take possession of you, because it's both a loss of the self and an empowerment happening in that experience. The other really interesting thing about Haitian Vodou, which is a very much syncretic religion, is lois are not just all pre-existing. There are new lois that come into existence, and there were certain lois that came into existence during the time of slavery to help empower them, and then later during the time of revolution. And these laws came into being, and then they would be called on and asked to possess the practitioner to empower them in revolution. And we have a French, I just want to read you really quick, a French observer who called this an absurd and bloodthirsty religion. So the French watching this are very perturbed. But he spoke of a mambo, a priestess. She is penetrated by the god. She trembles, her whole body goes into a convulsive state, and the oracle speaks through her mouth. After that, the Vodou dance begins. The agitation goes from one to another round the circle. Some pass out, others go into a sort of rage. All exhibit a nervous trembling. This sort of magnetism has caused whites found spying on the sect's secret practices to sometimes begin dancing. So there's this, end quote, there's a sense of this contagion, that this feeling, this possession can infect even people who are watching and are not sympathetic to this experience. And the observer, he calls this, they have weak minds, they're giving themselves over to a domination. And even though he's calling them weak-minded, he sees this as very, very dangerous. So it's interesting. And there's so much more to say about this, but basically, for them, possession is a form of empowerment, as well as a sort of entailing a fluid sense of self. And lastly, I don't want to take up too much time, is dreams. So much to say about this as well. But here, of course, probably figures you recognize, Emanuel Swedenborg, William Blake, and Wollstonecraft, Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a revolutionary in the 1790s, wrote about women's rights, married William Godwin, the anarchist, and is also the mother of Mary Shelley, the famous author of Frankenstein. She moved in the same circles as William Blake. And it's complicated. We know that Swedenborg, who had he was a Swedish mystic or visionary who had these visions in this mid 18th century, had been a scientist and engineer up to that point, though he came from a religious family. His father was a bishop, but was not interested in following that career. But in his 50s, he started having these incredible visions. And for him, dreams were a gateway to that point. And then he started exploring all kinds of what we would call altered states. Blake read Swedenborg. He was not always accepting everything he said, but he was definitely influenced by Swedenborg and definitely had, of course, an active dream life. I mean, Blake claimed that he received a new technique for engraving from his dead brother, who came to him in dream. He would see spirits and angels all the time. His father would beat him for claiming he would see angels, but he persisted in this. And though Blake, influenced very much by Swedenborg, was kind of obscure in his lifetime, he moved in a radical circle, and he believed that what we would call, like we all know about Corbin's idea of the imaginal realm, what we would call the imaginal realm for Blake was far more real than what he said, this vegetable universe. That is way more real. And Blake even claimed to imagine is to see, and this is very much influenced by Swedenborg, who himself had, along with his visions, incredibly weird and all kinds of weird paranormal experiences, such as the famous Stockholm fire. I think we all know this story where he knew there was a fire in Stockholm hundreds of miles away, and Kant could not explain it. Kant even investigated it and had to admit that this was verifiable by many respectable witnesses, but could not explain how Swedenborg knew that. Swedenborg also had many scientific theories and philosophical theories that predated Kant. And Kant even wrote, I don't know how he came up with this, because it's just like my theory of subjectivity, but he's crazy. So I don't, Kant was actually obsessed with him and tried to write to him, but we don't have any evidence that Swedenborg wrote back. Blake very much engaged with Swedenborg. We have Blake's margin notes on Swedenborg's text, Heaven and Hell, and moved in these circles. And so even though Blake believed in this, what we would call the imaginal realm, was real, just as Swedenborg would say, that doesn't mean that Blake was not politically engaged. That doesn't mean, oh, if that's more real than the physical world, I don't care about the physical world. No, he was very much involved in all kinds of politics. He supported the French Revolution. I have his line on the French Revolution. It's really beautiful. He wrote a poem about it. Let's see if I can find it here. Sick the mountains and all their vineyards weep. That's in France. The ancient dawn calls us to awake from slumbers of 5,000 years. I awake, but my soul is in dreams. For Blake, very much, revolution is spiritual renewal. It's not just the social and the political. And even though he was pretty obscure in his lifetime, as I mentioned, he did engravings for Wollstonecraft, and Wollstonecraft went to France during the Revolution, as opposed to Edmund Burke, who decried the French Revolution but never went to France. And so he's very much engaged in this mystical, visionary world, as you see in this image, but for him that is not divorced from a political engagement. In fact, it makes sense that you believe in this, that everyone has this divine spark, or Blake would call it poetic genius. So these experiences are just unruly, and they lead to all kinds of radical potential. And just as I was pulling a stunt at the beginning of this talk, threatening to do violence to the audio equipment and leave you without a talk, leaving you possibly bereft, so too are these experiences unruly and hard to fit in and difficult to explain. And they often lead to subversive thinking or even revolutionary thought. But more importantly, what I want to leave you with is that when you're not in a normal state of consciousness, you're not bound by usual ways of being and usual ways of knowing. So that means that you're in a space of radical possibility or boundless potentiality. So not always, but sometimes when you're in that space, you realize that also the physical and social world are not fixed. They are subject to transformation. So revolutions in the social political world are then just a continuation, extension, or mirroring of the revolutions already taking place inside of them. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you for listening.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu Copyright 2026 The President and Fellows of Harvard College